Welcome back to Kuma English Listening Hub. Today, we are stepping inside a world that, according to many headlines over the last 20 years, should have vanished by now: the independent bookshop. In the age of next-day delivery, algorithmic recommendations, and discounted online giants, small bookshops on high streets across Britain and beyond are, rather surprisingly, still here. Some are even thriving. So what on earth is going on? Why do people still bother to push open a creaky door, ring a little bell, and walk into a physical shop when they could buy any book with a tap of the thumb? In this episode, we will explore how independent bookshops survive, how they have reinvented themselves, and why they matter far more than their modest floor space might suggest. Let us begin with the myth of inevitable decline. If you were following the news in the early 2000s, you would have been forgiven for assuming that bookshops were done for. The narrative was rather gloomy. First came the big chain stores with heavy discounts, then online retailers with ruthless pricing and seemingly infinite stock, and finally ebooks, which were confidently predicted to kill off print altogether. Yet, the reality turned out to be rather more complicated. Yes, many shops closed. Whole chains disappeared. Outer suburban retail parks stopped bothering with anything resembling a local bookshop. But at the same time, a quieter trend was unfolding. New independent bookshops began to open in places where, by rights, they had no business surviving. Small coastal towns, unfashionable suburbs, even streets already dominated by charity shops and coffee chains. What these new shops understood, often better than the older ones they replaced, is that a bookshop can no longer afford to be simply a place that sells books. It has to be, in a very literal sense, a cultural space. Walk into a modern independent bookshop and you will notice several things immediately. First, there is the curation. You are not merely confronted with endless shelves arranged in opaque alphabetical order. Instead, you see carefully chosen tables, brilliant debuts, translated gems, queer fiction, climate writing, forgotten classics. Every selection is a kind of editorial decision, almost like the front page of a newspaper. Someone, somewhere has thought, right, what do our readers actually need to see this week? And has then moved the titles accordingly. This act of curation is crucial. Online, you are constantly nudged towards what everyone else is buying, or what a mysterious algorithm thinks you ought to enjoy. In a small shop, a human being is making quite specific and, at times, rather eccentric choices. And that, for many customers, is precisely the point. Second, there is the presence of the bookseller. At a surface level, a bookseller helps you find the right shelf. But in a good independent bookshop, they do something far more valuable. They act as an expert reader, a cultural translator, and occasionally a confessor. If you stand in a bookshop for long enough, you will overhear conversations that you would rarely encounter anywhere else. A tired teacher desperate for a novel that will grip a disengaged teenager. A grandparent who has completely lost track of children's literature. A young professional who wants something more challenging than their usual airport thriller but is not quite ready to launch into Proust in the original French. The bookseller listens, asks a few disarmingly precise questions, and then pulls out one or two titles with the confidence of a good GP making a diagnosis. When they get it right, the customer often responds with visible relief. Oh, that sounds spot on. I'll give it a go. It is this human recommendation, based on years of wide reading and a genuine interest in people, that online reviews cannot quite reproduce. A 5-star rating does not look you in the eye, ask what you have recently enjoyed, and then say, in that case, you might be keen on this. It's a bit left field, but trust me. That tiny phrase, trust me, is the essence of the independent bookshop's survival strategy. Third, there is the space itself. In many British towns, the local bookshop has become a kind of unofficial community center, not in an earnest municipal way, but quietly, almost by accident. There might be a children's story time on Saturday mornings when parents, utterly knackered after a long week, sit on small chairs nursing takeaway coffees while someone reads aloud and keeps their offspring spellbound. In the evening, the tables are pushed aside for author events, readings, interviews, launches of tiny poetry presses that would never get a look in at a big chain. Occasionally, the wine is poured with such generosity that you begin to suspect the book sales are only half the point. The goal is not immediate profit, but the cultivation of a habit. If you want to encounter ideas, writers, and neighbors, you go to the bookshop. The most successful shops lean into this role. Some host book clubs that are properly intergenerational, not just groups of like-minded mates comparing the latest prize-winning novel. Others run writing workshops, language conversation circles, or niche reading groups on everything from Japanese crime fiction to nature writing. In short, the bookshop transforms itself from a retail outlet into a social and intellectual hub. Once that shift happens, the logic of the place changes. You are no longer simply a customer, you are a participant. Now, let us talk about money, because sentiment alone will not pay the rent. Independent bookshops operate on tight margins. They cannot compete on price with online giants, who can afford to slash prices to levels that would leave a small shop utterly sunk. So instead of racing to the bottom, good independents reframe what they are selling. Yes, they sell books, but they are also selling experience, taste, and trust. Some add a cafe, not in a cynical linger here and buy another cappuccino kind of way, but as a natural extension of the atmosphere. Others develop a sideline in greeting cards, notebooks, or locally made gifts, carefully chosen so that the shop does not feel cluttered or tacky. Many experiment with subscription services. You pay a monthly fee, fill in a short questionnaire about your tastes, and each month a hand-picked book lands on your doormat, often with a little note explaining why it was chosen. This turns reading into an ongoing relationship. You are not simply buying an object. You are entrusting part of your intellectual life to the bookseller. Bookshops also cultivate partnerships. They work with local schools to organize author visits. They provide book stalls at festivals, talks, or academic conferences. They collaborate with libraries rather than seeing them as rivals. Each of these activities might look modest in isolation, but together they create a web of connections that makes the shop much harder to ignore or replace. Of course, it would be naive to pretend that all is rosy. Running an independent bookshop is brutally hard work. Rents in many British cities are eye-watering. Business rates can be punishing. The hours are long. Stock must be ordered, unpacked, and returned with maddening efficiency. Social media has to be updated. Websites need constant attention. And at the end of all that, you might still spend your afternoon recommending a beautiful hardback to someone who thanks you warmly, then announces they will order it online because it is a few quid cheaper. For booksellers, this can be infuriating. They rarely say anything out loud. British politeness tends to prevail, but you can almost hear the internal monologue, "Fair enough, mate. But if everyone does that, we won't be here next year when you fancy a proper browse." Yet, over the last decade, public awareness of this problem has grown. Campaigns such as Shop Local and Save Our High Street might sound a bit cliched, but they have had some impact. Many readers now grasp that spending a little more in a local bookshop is not an act of charity. It is a deliberate investment in the kind of town or city they wish to inhabit. After all, a high street lined solely with anonymous delivery lockers and identikit chains is, frankly, rather bleak. There is also a deeper cultural question at play here. What is a book for? If a book is simply a container for information or a story, then perhaps the cheapest, quickest method of delivery makes sense. But if a book is also an object that carries memory, identity, and aesthetic pleasure, then where and how you buy it matters. Many British readers can tell you, sometimes with embarrassing precision, where they bought a particular book. The second-hand paperback found in a tiny shop on a rainy weekend in Whitby. The collection of poems pressed into their hands at a small London book launch, signed in a wobbly scrawl by a nervous but hopeful author. The children's picture book they bought in a hurry because their niece had spotted the cover in the window and fallen in love with it. These stories are not sentimental decoration. They become part of the meaning of the book itself. the bookshop is woven into the narrative. Interestingly, the survival of independent bookshops has coincided with a renewed interest in other so-called obsolete formats: vinyl records, analog photography, even handwritten letters. None of these things is strictly necessary. You can listen to any song on a streaming platform. You can take thousands of photos on your phone. You can send a message instantly to anyone on the planet. And yet, people continue to seek out slower, more tactile, more embodied experiences. Bookshops, with their distinctive smell of paper and ink, their slightly chaotic shelves, and their handwritten staff recommendations taped to the fronts of books, cater to this craving for texture in a digital age. In a curious twist, some bookshops are also embracing technology to secure their future. They run online shops of their own. They join collective platforms that allow them to receive a share of profits from internet sales. They host virtual author events for readers who live too far away to attend in person. The clever ones treat the internet not as a mortal enemy, but as another tool. From a linguistic perspective, independent bookshops are also important. They are places where language is taken seriously but not solemnly, where puns and window displays are still considered perfectly acceptable, where staff take quiet pleasure in introducing customers to writers from outside the traditional canon, including voices that were historically marginalized. In Britain, many bookshops have consciously broadened their shelves. More books by writers of color, more translations, more small presses from the regions rather than just London. A customer walking in and asking for something a bit different might be steered towards a Nigerian speculative novel, a memoir in verse by a Scottish poet, or a work of nature writing by a young, disabled author challenging all the old cliches about the countryside. In this sense, independent bookshops are not relics of some cozy, monocultural past. They are, at their best, engines of linguistic and cultural change. So, what lessons can we draw from the survival of these shops? First, the idea that technology inevitably destroys older forms is, at best, a half-truth. What usually happens is more complex. Older forms are forced to adapt, to become more intentional, more self-aware, and more rooted in human relationships. Those that make the transition can, surprisingly, come out stronger. Second, value is not always reducible to price. You can measure the cost of a book in pounds and pence. It is much harder to quantify the worth of a conversation with a bookseller who has known you, in some cases, since you were a teenager. Or the sense of belonging that comes from walking into a place where the staff greet you with a small nod of recognition because they remember what you bought last time. Third, and perhaps most importantly, independent bookshops remind us that culture does not simply happen. It is not a neutral stream of content produced elsewhere and delivered to our devices. It is curated, debated, sold, argued over, and occasionally dropped on the floor by a child who is far too excited about dragons. Of course, one could object that this is all very romantic, and that for every charming bookshop with a loyal customer base, there are several that quietly close their doors. That is true. There is nothing inevitable or guaranteed about their survival. But perhaps that is what makes those that do survive so precious. They endure not because they are frozen in time, but because they are nimble, stubborn, and unashamedly human in an increasingly automated world. If you are learning English, by the way, independent bookshops can be a brilliant resource. Many stock-graded readers, dual language editions, and carefully chosen non-fiction with clear prose. Some host English conversation groups or book clubs specifically for readers whose first language is not English. And even if your spoken English is still a work in progress, most British booksellers will be patient to a fault. They are used to navigating accents, hesitations, and half-finished sentences in search of the right recommendation. If you can tell them, even roughly, what you like, they will do their level best to sort you out. So, the next time you are tempted to click Buy Now on a cheap paperback, you might pause for a moment and ask yourself, do I want only the book, or do I also want the world that comes with it? The conversation, the creaky floorboard, the unexpected discovery on a shelf you did not even mean to look at. In the end, independent bookshops survive because enough people decide that those unspectacular, everyday pleasures are worth keeping. They decide that, in a world where so much feels impersonal and rushed, there is still something rather wonderful about walking into a small shop, chatting with a slightly harassed but deeply knowledgeable bookseller, and walking out with a story you did not know you needed. And if that sounds a bit idealistic, well, fair enough. But for many of us, that is a trade-off we are quite happy to make. Thanks for listening to Kuma English Listening Hub. If you can, find a local independent bookshop where you live, step inside and let the shelves surprise you. Until next time, cheers.